And part of the reason that white folks in America have so little understanding of faith is that we haven't been able to trust our God if we weren't in control, which is why we have to, in the American story, we have to look to the brush arbors and the margins of the plantation to reconstruct and relearn the gospel, because that's where people who were not in control heard the story of Jesus, heard the story about how that God had brought, Israel out of Egypt before they raised that Jesus from the dead. And if God can do that, then my Lord, maybe he'll even, if God delivered Daniel, maybe he'll even deliver me. Maybe when we hear, go down Moses way down in Egypt land, maybe when we hear swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, maybe we can even have the faith to run off into the woods and, grab Harriet Tubman by the hand, they called her Moses, and never look back, just believing that this story was going to get us to freedom. So that is the experience of faith that I'm trying to lean into,
Every day I've known it grows only deeper.
Oh, man. I'm excited about this one. What's up, everybody?
What's up?
We're the Deconstructionist Podcast. Here we are, deconstructing on a podcast yet again.
Oh, yeah.
What's up, John?
What's up, Adam?
How's it going, man?
Summertime.
Summertime,
Spent
indeed.
a lot of time at the pool.
It has been a great summer.
Yeah.
I just took my whole family to Taylor Swift.
Yeah, you did.
This wonderful, wonderful person from our new church named Leslie. You know who you are. You're an angel. Gave us like a gift, like manna from heaven. Gave us 4 Taylor Swift tickets.
Did she even have any idea, what a T-Swift fan you are?
She did, actually.
Okay.
I don't hide that.
I was like...
I don't hide. You know I don't hide it.
I was like, does she have any clue what a gift that was to you?
Seriously.
Wow.
I know.
I remember you texted Clay and I, and I was like, Adam must be doing, cartwheels.
It was
Bad back and all, cartwheels.
It was a great experience. Suffice to say,
Yeah.
Angels are real. God is real.
That's right.
And Leslie, you are amazing.
That's right.
And oh my gosh, dude, what a fun summer it's been. This episode, I could not be more excited about. We, back in the day, we had Drew Hart on. We definitely like to talk about issues of race and inequality and justice and kind of things that are going on politically, because you can't really talk about religion and ultimate things and people mattering and things like that and not talk about issues. And there's a book that, if you listen to our Richard Rohr 101 episode, Father Rohr, good Papa Bear, talked about a book that he had just received and he was freaking out about. He loved it. It's called Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion, by an up-and-coming author and activist named Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. And we just got right on that, didn't we?
So good.
Got right on that. Because we have the book too.
Yeah.
And we kind of started paging through it, and we were like, oh my gosh, this conversation has to happen.
Yeah, what a nice guy with an interesting perspective. He graduated from Duke Divinity School. He's associated with that new monasticism movement, which we talk about a little bit on the podcast.
Kind of like the Shane Claiborne.
Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah.
But he's doing some cool things, and as you'll hear him describe, he's not just a guy who talks about it and writes about it. He's actually boots on the ground. And
the Poor People's Campaign.
Unbelievable.
And what he's talking about with moral fusion politics, and oh my gosh,
he's a doer.
Man, and there is some meat in this conversation. You are not going to be bored, friends.
No.
And this is hopefully, my hope would be that this inspires lots of reflection within you as a person, as it did with me, and I think for you, John. Lots of just reflection on how our faith or our attempt to practice faith really relates to the real actual world, and seeing that as accurately as we possibly can, and then understanding how what we have believed and how we have believed about our own faith may need some reconstructing.
Yeah.
May need some work.
Yeah, and I think this is a good one if you enjoy this podcast, and I think we bring up some important, timely topics, especially when it comes to race relations in the United States. So those of you who are listening from the U.S., this is, obviously an important topic that we have to talk about right now. There's some definite issues and some brokenness, some broken things going on in our country. But if you enjoy this episode, I definitely encourage you to get it back and listen to our Drew Hart episode as well. I think the two complement each other pretty nicely. So
yeah, it's like so many people on this podcast, or that are listening, have found themselves kind of wondering what the heck is going on with the version of religion that they were given, and at the same time, they're probably feeling, a lot of them are feeling very pulled towards issues of practical justice and what's going on the news, on their streets, in their towns. And what this guy does is kind of bring together, like, hey, you know how you've had that feeling like something might be wrong with the gospel that you've been given? Well, that actually directly affects and is a part of what is going on your streets. And yes, it is possible that the gospel was hijacked for agendas, and that might be why you started to feel uncomfortable with it. And maybe, I don't know, just maybe, that is actually possibly the Spirit making a lot of us uncomfortable with what we have, so that we search for new and more equal and more righteous, for lack of a better word, ground.
Yeah.
How about that?
I like it.
So this guy is just awesome. He's walking the walk, talking the talk, and what a blast. What a great book.
Yeah.
And thanks for everybody that's jumping on Patreon.
Oh,
Had another recent surge of a whole bunch of people that just wanting to be a part of what we're doing. And we are trying to make good on answering emails and getting stuff out. And John works his rear end off for you guys. You don't even know.
I'm still catching up on some orders, but
you're doing great, buddy.
So if there is something that you haven't gotten and you've been waiting for a minute, please email us. Likewise, if you have any questions that you guys want us to answer on our future YouTube channel, we're going to try to post some videos on there as we can. So if you guys have some questions that you'd like us to kind of discuss or whatever, some mailbag type questions, we'd love to put those out there. We will be scheduling the Skype calls very, very soon, so look out for that. There's a scheduler program that we've got going, and so we'll be sending out via our social media some alerts on that. So if you guys signed up for that through our Patreon, if you like the book club thing that we're doing, you can sign up for that. If you haven't already, we will send you a book every month. So we've got some good ones selected for the next 2 months.
So good.
So, but other than that, check our show notes for the bands.
Yep.
And thanks for supporting us. We can't thank you guys enough.
No, we love you guys. It's so fun that you want to just keep having these conversations, and you are going to have plenty to talk about after this episode, let me tell you. So without further ado, we give you Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. Couldn't get the freaking in there. Sorry, buddy.
Through the waters, missing you, and it broke my heart when I felt the truth. My father has a father too.
Well, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. You just go by Jonathan or John?
Jonathan's good.
Jonathan is good. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for making some time in this hot summer night for us to get indoors and come together and have a great conversation about things that really matter. We really appreciate you being with us here tonight.
I'm glad for the chance to talk.
Well, for those that aren't familiar with your work, figure the best way to start off is why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and kind of the work that you're involved in currently.
Well, I'm a son of the church and a son of the South. I was raised here in North Carolina in the Baptist church by people who loved Jesus and wanted me to love Jesus. Made me memorize the Bible in the King James Version because if it was good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for us. We were going to stick with it.
Right.
And I'm really grateful for the way that story, got down inside of me, and for the way it, has always been real for everyone I knew in the world I grew up in. But I, grew up in the heyday of the moral majority movement, and our people really got caught up in right-wing politics. And I don't think we knew exactly what was happening to us. I certainly didn't know all the money and machinations that were going into targeting us as a group of people to serve a political agenda. But I was an ambitious kid and wanted to, be part of what made sense in that world. So I started trying to become president of the United States for Jesus when I was a teenager. And I thought the first step, in that direction would be to get involved in politics. So I paged for Strom Thurmond of South Carolina when I was in high school still. Strom Thurmond was once the Dixiecrat candidate for president, and I think more than anyone else is responsible for bringing the old Southern Democrats who were hardcore segregationists into the Republican Party in the late 1960s. But at any rate, that was just the world that I knew and the world I'd grown up in. And getting into D.C. and kind of seeing that from the inside was sort of an awakening for me. And I came to, but I think a lot of young people have a kind of, crisis of faith where they have to grapple with, what they really believe and who they want to be. And for me, it was a crisis of realizing the deep contradiction between the things that I loved the most about Jesus and the story of the church, and the harsh reality of what so-called Christian politics looked like there in the late 90s in Washington, D.C. And I was disillusioned by all of that and didn't know exactly what I was going to do. But about that time, I met a preacher from North Carolina named William Barber, who didn't look like me. He was a black man who had grown up in the eastern part of the state. And I heard him preaching the gospel in kind of in a different key. And it sounded right to my ear, and I was just drawn to it. And even though politically I was about as far from his world as somebody could be in this American story, I reached out and he embraced me as a brother in Christ, and kind of invited me into what I now understand as moral fusion politics. So we can talk more about what that means, but in summary, I'm a Jesus-loving Southern boy who's trying to live my life in service to moral fusion politics for the sake of trying to pursue the common good in the midst of pretty chaotic times in this country. I think that's how I would summarize it.
Man, that is so good. Thank you for giving us about 1 million more questions to ask you now.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Before we just kind of dive into a whole bunch of questions, though, a couple things just based on where you're talking. Now, I know you're not only a writer and you're not only just involved in politics. You're doing some pretty specific things. Right before we flipped the mics on here, you were talking to us a little bit about what you're doing currently with this the Poor People's Campaign and this 40 days of action and going around and touring a little bit. Could you give us a little bit of a taste and a flavor for the kind of work you do there? I think that'll help kind of really set things up and color things well.
Well, 50 years ago, after the civil rights movement had captured the moral imagination of the country, and I think in many ways, we had a kind of come to Jesus moment in the mid 20th century, where people who claimed, to both be Christian and participate in a democracy realize that there's something deeply wrong about excluding some people from that common life that we share because of the color of their skin. Most people celebrate that now. Most people celebrate the civil rights movement and its achievements, the way it changed the culture of the country. But 50 years ago, that movement and all the people involved in it, Dr. King certainly as a spokesperson, but also, just hundreds and hundreds of people who were deeply committed to it and had given their life to it for years, decided that what was needed was what they call a Poor People's Campaign. a campaign that would bring together poor black folks of the South, who they had been working with because they had been excluded from the political system, but bring those folks together with people who had been economically marginalized, poor white people in Appalachia, Chicano workers on the West Coast, Native American people, whose lands had been stolen from them and who had been marginalized from mainstream American society for centuries. All of those folks came together in this vision of having a fusion coalition that would go to Washington, D.C. and demand that the political system grapple seriously with the economic disparity that exists in the United States of America. And 50 years later, we're in a situation where certainly some things have improved in the country, but a lot of things are just as bad or have gotten worse. And we did an audit of America looking at 5 categories: systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and what we call the distorted moral narrative, the way that faith gets used to prop up injustice. Something that's I think more and more palpably present in our common life. When, for example, the Attorney General is willing to give a Bible study to justify the separation of children from their families at the border. But at any rate,
not his best moment. Not his best moment.
No. Even Brother Russell Moore from the Southern Baptist Convention that I grew up in was on TV the other night saying, sometimes we just didn't pay close enough attention in Sunday school, and we need to, we need a little refresher.
Yeah.
But it's actually not that kind of simple slip up. It's I think it's a much deeper problem. It's what I've been trying to describe as a slaveholder religion, and in so many ways, this campaign is trying to point out how that misuse of faith has harmed people, and harmed people through policies that have pretended to be pro-democracy, have pretended to even be Christian, and yet in very real and even measurable ways have created increasing inequality and increasing injustice for poor Black and brown communities. So that campaign was really started by those folks 50 years ago. There are people all over the country that have taken it up again today, not just to kind of commemorate it, but to really relaunch it, to say we have to take up that baton and go the next mile of the way. And so that's a campaign that's been happening in 40 states and in the District of Columbia since Mother's Day. And these 40 days of direct action have really been a way of launching these moral fusion coalitions that are state-based and that are going to continue to build power among poor people, build connections across issues, and we hope and pray make a real difference in our electoral politics, but also in the policy vision of whoever gets elected over the next several cycles.
Man, before we dive into your book and really start asking you some questions, because we really want people to read this book, we agree with many of our friends who've endorsed it and been talking about it on the interwebs, including the good father Richard Rohr and former guest Drew Hart. And we were talking with our other friend Caitlin Curtis recently, and she was just like, "Man, you guys got to get Jonathan on." We're like, "We know, we're going to. We're trying to plan." It's just there's so much.
Well,
to talk about.
You talk to a lot of people. Those were all great folks.
Yeah, man.
I'm glad you've been talking. You've been talking to my friends.
Yeah, good, man. It's good. We're all in good company, friends of friends. But there's a term that you use to define yourself, and I think it's going to probably lay some good track when we start talking about the book. Talk about what you mean when you're talking about moral fusion politics a little bit. Give us a little definition of that, or explain that for us a little bit.
Yeah. So first, moral. almost everything in our public life gets framed as left versus right, liberal versus conservative, or increasingly globalist versus nationalist. These kind of binary ways of saying that you have to pick sides. That these two sides have different ways of they're very ideological divisions, right? Different ways of thinking about it, and the kind of ideal world is that these two ideological differences kind of hash it out and find some middle ground, and we assume that that's the best way forward. When, as a matter of fact, I think in some deep and profound ways, both sides, if you frame it in terms of sides, have been willing to go along with some extreme injustices in this country from the very beginning. I mean, we talk about just the establishment of the country in a doctrine of discovery that used religious justification to steal land and kill people.
Yeah,
that's something that if we're going to talk about it in terms of sides, neither side ever repented of that in any significant way. One of the ironies right now is that the Republican Party was established as an anti-slavery party in the mid-19th century, and yet in so many ways, especially since the late 1960s, it's the party that in this country has been willing to use the divide and conquer tactics of the racist past in the South to manipulate the whole country. And so in so many ways, for me, this is not about left or right, but it's about going a little deeper and asking, what kind of fundamental moral values do people in this country have as citizens? What kind of moral values should we have as people who claim to follow Jesus and who want the Bible to be some guide for our life? Not just when we're at home with our families, but our life in public. So this is a movement that's trying to be moral in the sense that it's trying to ask the question: what sort of policies in our public life would be true to the moral claims of our faith traditions and our constitutional traditions? And then it's a fusion movement in that it's trying to bring together people who've been pitted against one another. So after the Civil War, when black folks were first included in the political system in the South, every one of them was a Republican, because the Republican Party had been the anti-slavery party. But the Democratic Party had such control in the South at that time that there was no possibility of a Republican Party having a ruling majority. And so those black Republicans reached out to others, sort of other potential allies. There was a populist movement at the time, connected with some of those folks, connected with, I guess, people we would call independents today. And they formed what they called a fusion party. And fusion parties controlled the South during Reconstruction. They were black and white folks working together to try to do things like have public education that would serve everyone, have guaranteed living wages. Because of the Freedmen's Bureau and its program of having health care hospitals for poor people in the South, it was a movement that was trying to talk about what does it mean for everybody to have health care in the way that you could imagine health care in the late 19th century. So this fusion movement is this notion that basically everybody does better when everybody does better. And yet so often the people who are marginalized by our society get pitted against one another. And so calling together people who have been divided by race, who've been divided by regional and sectional differences, have been divided by religion in some cases, coming together in a fusion coalition that says we're going to stand together on some of these moral values that we all hold in common. That's moral fusion politics, and that's something that I learned from Reverend Barber, because he had learned it from his daddy, who had learned it from people before him in North Carolina history. It's a kind of wisdom that the freedom movement has passed down that I think has been largely ignored in our mainstream life in the country and in our education system. I mean, I learned very little about that in school, and I had good history classes, but it just wasn't the history that was written down and passed down by the ruling elites. It was the history that people always remembered, who had hoped that it could transform the structures of our society. It really is a reconstruction history, and I think what I learned from Reverend Barber is that the essential work of democracy in America is always reconstruction, because you can't practice repentance in public life when a country was founded on this much sin, original sin, without committing yourself to reconstructing the structures that perpetuate that sin.
Wanted to see the light, thought I could find the fight in me to get me through my day. Oh, the ocean is breaking.
Man, so one of the things I think you do a really, really great job in the book is really breaking down racism, specifically how racism kind of crops up and appears today. And one of the things that we talked to Dr. Drew Hart about when we interviewed him about a year ago, is just the fact that a lot of folks just aren't even aware of their own racial biases. And you have this really great part in your book where you talk about the fact that you took this racial bias test. And I remember taking the exact same test and just being shocked and kind of appalled at myself. I'm like, I consider myself to be pretty cultured and inclusive and that sort of thing. But one of the things that you talk about in your book and Dr. Hart talked about as well is the fact that racism is not it's not as obvious and in your face as maybe it once was in the 60s. We're not necessarily burning crosses in your front yard anymore, but maybe you cross the street when you see an African American individual walking on the other side without even thinking about it. So I wonder if you could talk about what you call waking up to racial blindness.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say God bless Brother Drew Hart and others like him who have ministered to people who think they're white in black skin, because frankly, this blindness that I'm trying to name is something that I'm just painfully aware that people like me can't see. We blind people have a hard time finding our own way out of our blindness. I often think about that story of the Apostle Paul when he was, of course, called Saul on the way to Damascus, papers in hand to persecute the church down there, because he was a person of privilege in his society. He was a Roman citizen. He had combined his privilege with piety. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, he said, by his own account, surpassing everyone else in his righteousness, and yet his privilege plus his piety equaled a commitment to persecution. He's going to persecute the Christian movement, and Jesus knocks him off his horse, and he's blind. And the gift of that moment is that for the first time he realizes his blindness, right? I think that's what that story is about to me. All of a sudden he's knocked off his horse, and he can see that he can't see, or that he's been seeing everything wrongly. And the fascinating thing about that story is Jesus himself is speaking to him, and Jesus tells him, look, you got to go put your hand in the hand of a brother named Ananias. You don't know him, but he's one of these people, check your papers. He's on the list. He's one of these people you were going to round up. one of these people that, you thought was the enemy, and he's the person who's going to have to help you learn to see. And I think, if we want to be real biblical about it, that's about as honest a story as we can find in the Bible of what it means for a white person like myself, somebody who is immersed in the world of whiteness, right? The world that whiteness created, in a way that that I see through that lens, and yet, have been on this journey of learning that whiteness blinds me to what's really happening in so many people's lives. And learning that has meant learning to listen to people who are impacted by the lie, right? Like I was just talking to a brother today. I mean, when I talk to white folks about this racial blindness these days, a lot of the conversations are about immigration. And, people are at pains to say, I'm not trying to be racist. This isn't about racism. This is about, respecting law, or this is about, not wanting our culture to fall apart. Or, there's all kinds of ways of narrating it. But what I was trying to help listen to the mother whose children have been taken from her arms. Unless you listen to the cries of the children, you can't even imagine what the ideology that you're playing out to justify it actually means for real people. That's racial blindness from my perspective, and I think having a story like this is important because it helps us see that our faith, if it's whitewashed in the whiteness, our faith can just perpetuate the blindness. Nobody was more pious than Paul, but he was persecuting Jesus. Paul, why are you persecuting me? That's what Jesus says to him. That's some greeting to get when you meet Jesus face to face.
Yeah. Seriously, man.
That's not well done, my good and faithful servant.
Well, he still had some work to do.
That's right.
He still had some work to do. So your book's called Reconstructing the Gospel, and I don't know if you've ever seen our logo, but we're all about reconstruction here, even though our name is the Deconstructionists. We put the D in brackets, trying to focus on the construction, because it's all about this stuff. But reading through your book, I realized, because I'm a little too thick at first, that using that word reconstruction really harkens back to a lot of things, and bringing the gospel into this conversation is something that I really want you to kind of talk about. So when you talk about reconstructing, using that word intentionally, the gospel, what are you talking about here? If you could give us, we want people to read the book, but we want to get to the heart of the issue too. So how does the gospel need reconstructing, and what gospel are you talking about? Because obviously, there's different people that use the gospel for different reasons, and I'll just let you go.
Yeah. Well, early in the book, I tell the story of Easter Sunday at the Colfax Courthouse in Louisiana. In some ways, I think it captures how twisted our understanding of the gospel can become with racial blindness. So during the period of American history that we call Reconstruction, there were, of course, I think as most people know, there were white Southerners who were indignant that these, Northern Union soldiers had come down, with their carpetbagger friends, as they said, and had insulted and stomped on their way of life. They were determined to overthrow Reconstruction from the very beginning, and they thought their God was with them in that crusade. And so on Easter Sunday morning, after celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, a band of white men went out to the Colfax Courthouse, and they took a cannon out of the arsenal there, and they shot up the courthouse and burned it down and killed everybody that ran out, who were trying to defend the democratically elected local council members who had been elected, of course, by black folks who were able to vote at the time. just the fact that happened on Easter Sunday,
Oh.
and that the people who were doing that were celebrating it as, in their language, a redemption, as God returning their land to them, is, I think, a very visceral image and scene to understand how, in so many ways, the gospel can be turned against its very purpose. I mean, you can draw a line from that time to, the folks who lynched black men on the town square right outside their churches on Saturday nights, all up until the 1940s in the South, and would then, get dressed and go to Sunday church with their families the next morning, and even stand outside and take pictures with the body hanging in the tree. The kind of perversion of the gospel to justify the order that we think is godly runs all the way up until the present, which is why I was saying earlier, Brother Jeff Sessions, using Romans 13 to justify the separation of families at the border is, to me, just, the latest chapter in this long story of slaveholder religion. So that's one gospel. That's the gospel that Frederick Douglass called, in the mid-19th century, the Christianity of the slaveholder. He said there's an essential difference between the Christianity of the slaveholder and the Christianity of Christ. And he said, between the two, I see the widest possible difference. So if we're going to, especially for those of us who have inherited, slaveholder religion with our blinders on, not even seeing, the ways that that we were perpetuating a story that uses the gospel to deny the gospel's purpose, then I think reconstructing the gospel is about taking seriously how we've misread the Bible and how we need to learn it anew, and that necessarily means learning to read it with people that we haven't been with, and learning stories that we haven't known. So that's what I mean when I talk about reconstructing the gospel.
Mm.
One of the things I'd really love to hear you talk about, because you mentioned this in your book when you're talking specifically about racism, you say that it's not necessarily about hate, but about power. And the term power, it seems to me that's the thing that kind of ties the entire book together, between religion and politics. I would love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is why, white folks don't like to think of ourselves as racist. And we will regularly, especially Christian white folks, will regularly condemn what we think is racism. Charlottesville last year, when the Klan and the Nazis were trying to unite the right, and were even willing to run down somebody in the street. You'll find broad condemnation of that. I mean, it's even hard for most people to swallow that the current president of the United States can't just speak out and condemn something like that. That kind of explicit racism is simply not politically correct. But when I say that racism has never been about hate, it's always been about control. Part of what I'm saying is that the kind of sort of obvious disdain for other people and need to kind of crush them and brutalize them in public has always been a minority movement among white supremacy, and it's one that's been looked down on by those in power because it's just messy. It just kind of makes people cringe. So even during slavery, people cringed a little bit when folks brutalized slaves because what they wanted was for black bodies to serve the economy, not to have to deal with the gruesome reality of someone having to beat these enslaved people in order to get them to serve their economic interests. So I think part of recognizing the structure of racism is seeing that it's always been about serving a certain kind of control. And as long as white people have been in control, they've been very happy to celebrate, for example, unity. There's calls for unity these days from those who are in political power, and those calls always remind me of the redemption movement that just after it had both violently and through voter suppression overthrown Reconstruction in the South. In 1877, the number one call from pulpits across the South was for unity. Let us dwell together. And white folks always thought that they had black folks' best interests in mind. And so it wasn't some sort of hatred for black people that drove them. It was this sense that they were right and they knew better, and if they were in control, things would be all right. It
reminds me of that part in your book when you're in the church. I think it was the same chapter on Christmas, and you asked, like, were the slaveholders and the slaves taking communion together, or somebody asked that.
Yeah,
and it's like, didn't they ever like realize like just how screwed up that is? Like, didn't anybody ever take something away from that and go, I think we might be off here? Yeah. And no, because they could feel like they were unified there. They could use it to continue to endorse what they wanted. Look, he's my brother. It's my family.
Right. I think that's something that had to be learned as I read through the church's grappling with the institution of slavery. There was serious pushback in the early stages of most Christian movements, most of what we call denominations in the United States. There were people who honestly grappled with this, in conventions and Episcopal gatherings and such. And it took real work to learn to read the Bible to justify slavery. That's why I think it needs a name. Like, calling it slaveholder religion is a way of saying like people paid a lot of money to scholars and to preachers who wrote pamphlets and sermons that explained to people just why this was okay. And as they did, they won the argument. At least in terms of the denominations and their positions, and some denominations that even had condemned slavery early on went back and said, well, no, it's okay, and accepted these arguments. But yeah, I mean, I think at a visceral level, you're right. There must have been, for everyone who had a conscience, some sort of grappling that happened at that communion rail or at the altar or whatever your tradition might be.
Yeah. One of the things that I'd love to hear you speak on a little bit that just runs all throughout your book, I mean, there's several quotes that I could pull from to talk about this. A lot of people that listen to this podcast find themselves deconstructing a version of the gospel that's focused on saving souls from going to hell to burn forever. For anybody that doesn't use the kind of same doctrinal statements or language, that they might. In addition to that, we find most, or at least a large part of the people that listen to a show like this or others like it, are also deconstructing what they see as like, in kind of crude language, like just a white nationalistic version of Christianity.
Yeah.
And you kind of tie those together historically and presently. And I was wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about how those two ideas historically and currently relate to one another.
Yeah. Well, again, this is my inheritance. So in a lot of ways, I've just been grappling with everything that was passed on to me. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and what I knew growing up in the Southern Baptist Church is that we were committed to missions, because we were committed to sharing the gospel with the whole world. And what that meant, in the language of the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Church, was planting churches, because through churches, souls were saved. and that was the true mission of the church. Anything like building wells or making sure that people had food to eat was kind of secondary at best, and a lot of people talked about it as a distraction from the true work of ministering to people's souls. Well, when I started digging into the Southern Baptist Church's justifications of slavery over and against the abolitionists in the mid-19th century, one of the things I realized is that, as the abolition movement grew, and as there was a strong public moral case being made against slavery, people had to, in some ways, up their argument. You know how when you're losing an argument, you have to come up with something better to say.
Oh my
and so,
gosh, yeah.
For some time, people had been making these kind of extended arguments about the Old Testament and how there was a hierarchy of humanity in the creation story, or it came from the curse of Ham, and there were all these readings that kind of read racism into the Bible, and then used that to say that slavery is biblical in the Old Testament, and Paul doesn't condemn it in the New Testament, so it must still be okay in the 19th century. And that was kind of the line. But this guy Thornton Stringfellow and others, but Thornton Stringfellow was the Baptist in Virginia who wrote this up in a book that became pretty popular among the slaveholders, and he makes this kind of intricate, but also I think to almost anybody who would read it today, obscene argument that it was actually a good, not just for the plantation owners of the South, but a good for the enslaved people, that they were brought into slavery, because if they had died in pagan Africa and gone to hell, they would have burned in eternal torment. But since they got to come here and hear the good news of the gospel, from these good white Christians who would have their preachers preach revival meetings or whatever, where the slaves could hear it. So because of this, their souls might go to heaven. And he sort of waxes eloquent at the end of his argument and says, and maybe God will even raise up a missionary from among them that will go back to the great expanses of Ethiopia and share the good news. as if Christianity hadn't been in Africa for 2,000 years.
Right. So white people are saving the world, man.
That's right. And I had this realization that, oh my, like our commitment to missions and to sending missionaries into the uttermost parts of the world, and all the kind of stories of sacrifice and real Christianity that I had heard growing up were really deeply rooted in a very racist notion of even what evangelism means. So yeah, I mean that's one example, but I think digging into that history for me has helped me to see that some of the real issues that a lot of people are grappling with as they come to terms with the faith that they inherited are really not so much strictly theological issues as they are distortions of theology that come out of a very specific historical context. I come across a lot of people who have these deconstructionist kind of questions these days, who say, things like, for example, I love Jesus in the Gospels, but I have a hard time with this guy Paul. And like I get what they're saying, and I think I understand it, but I think a lot of times, like these kind of efforts to sort of name what it is that they're drawn to and what they aren't in the story is really not so much about discontinuity in the story, although I'm perfectly happy to talk about the wild diversity there is within the scripture. I don't think it all lines up to some kind of systematic understanding, but I don't think it's so much about the fact that the story can't hold together as it is that there's some real messed up ways of using the story that we've inherited and haven't even named.
Yeah, I mean, people don't necessarily have. This is why we still love the word deconstruction, because really John and I are just inviting people to stop letting people just rep the Bible for them. Like you probably don't have a problem with Paul because you've probably never encountered Paul outside of who repped Paul for you. to you, you know, who delivered Paul to you? Because that's probably what you're deconstructing. You probably haven't actually sat down with it and done some work and read some varying perspectives on, well, maybe there's some other ways of looking at this.
Yeah.
You know, you need to fire your rep.
Yeah.
You need to fire your sales rep on Paul and maybe actually engage Paul.
And, you know, that's what Jesus does. What you're describing as deconstruction is the Sermon on the Mount. You know,
Totally.
You've heard it said, but I say to you,
Right.
You know, there's another way of reading this tradition. Let me. I'm not trying to abolish anything, but let me read it differently.
Yeah,
you know,
maybe it could be translated, wake up, wake up, people.
Ministry.
Wake up, people. This is what it's saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man. One of the things I would love to get your take on, and I think you do such a great job of addressing it in this book, is this idea that the separation of church and politics, which is pretty ridiculous if you look at our current political structure. You know, seeing as in particular white evangelical Christianity seems so deeply ingrained in one of our political parties.
Yep.
You know, there's no mistake. There's no. I mean, if you look at the statistics from the last election, I think it was something around 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump. So and yet, you know, and they're voting on particular issues too. So if you break it down even further, you know, a lot of folks are voting based off of singular issues, you know, like abortion or like gay marriage or things of that nature. And so it kind of comes back to that whole power thing where there's a party that is essentially swinging votes by way of religion. And I would just love to get your take on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one response to this reality is to say that, you know, we should keep religion and politics separate. You know, the Southern Baptist Church just met down in Texas, and a whole lot of folks, including the fellow that they, you know, elected to be the new president, kind of talk this way. You know, that we've over politicized our faith, and you know, we need to keep the two distinct. Which, to me, you know, especially as we think about kind of interrogating the lie of whiteness. That feels rather naive to think that any kind of faith, if faith is, you know, trusting, you know, what God says about how you ought to live your whole life, that you could separate that from the decision you make about how you live your life in public. That to me seems wrongheaded, and in so many ways, I think slaveholder religion really has two legacies in the 20th century. On the one hand, it has this very political, a very partisan angle of, you know, using party politics to kind of baptize a kind of extremism and call it redemption. And so, you know, the folks in the 1870s were trying to take their country back. The folks in the 2016 election, we're trying to take their country back. There's lots of parallels between those two things. And I think that is a legacy of slaveholder religion. But the other legacy of slaveholder religion is this overwhelming way that when white people are in power, they can pretend that that faith is really about, you know, what you do on Sunday morning and how you feel in your heart, and maybe, you know, how you order your home or something, but it doesn't have to do with public life. And I think that's the kind of compromise of the mid 20th century that someone like, you know, Billy Graham strikes, where, you know, Billy Graham is pushing back against the fundamentalists of his day, you know, who would have been, you know, much more drawn to the kind of highly politicized sort of radicalism that we see today. He gets caught up in a little bit, but then, you know, he ultimately doesn't associate himself with the religious right and the moral majority as it emerged in the 1980s. And yet, in so many ways, if you look at the way, he's not willing to point out the very prophetic way that the gospel speaks to, for example, the need to challenge injustice or to, support things like the civil rights movement and movements for economic justice. That depoliticization of the faith is also a kind of legacy of whiteness and of slaveholder religion. So I think to grapple honestly with how faith is political is to take seriously what the Bible's vision for justice is, and to take seriously how Jesus and the prophets pursue that vision. It's not from a position of power, but it's from a position of really embracing the weak and the marginalized and those who've been pushed aside, standing in those spaces and saying, God hears your cries. And as a matter of fact, God is intervening, and God can speak through you to the powers in order to challenge the way that power is used to benefit few and to suppress the many.
Man, that leads right into a question that I wanted to ask you. So much of what you've said speaks to an issue that we talk about quite a bit on the show, especially if we've got the good Father Richard Rohr on. But it seems to come up a lot, and it's this issue of dualism, right? So, like you were talking about early in the episode, we've got this kind of false dichotomy. We've got, allegedly we just have the right and the left, and allegedly we just have the liberals and the conservatives, and allegedly we just have black and white, or, whatever. And it's just like, it's completely untrue. And that assumption in and of itself that we allow to keep happening in our consciousness is actually just capitulating to the power structures that are currently in place. And one of the things that you talk about in your book that I love that deals with this dualism is how the slaveholder religion did a really good job of separating soul and body. And I think that is huge. And if you could talk about that and the importance of why that, everything that I was kind of given growing up is like, the body, I guess, let's be modest and, let's kind of cover it up and, let's kind of just play that down. It's almost a little bit evil. It's the flesh even, but what, you really just need to take care of your soul. So have your quiet time, memorize a lot of Bible verses, get people out of hell and, that's the pinnacle. That's the summit of religion. And this dualism you talk about is a big problem and plays into slaveholder religion. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, you're already talking about it, my brother. I mean, I think you've got your sights on a deep impoverishment of the gospel in the highly racialized version of it that we inherited. I don't think white people often think of our gospel as racialized. You think about it in the academic sphere. These days you go to a seminary, you can take classes in Black theology and Latinx theology, and sometimes I just look around and say, like, well, why doesn't everybody else admit that they're teaching white theology? Like,
seriously.
Why is the norm the white theology? And well, I think that's just a way of saying that we have inherited a kind of faith that was willing to compromise itself to a society that was dominated by white supremacy in order to get along. And maybe I think ultimately because we didn't have enough faith. We didn't think it was possible to survive without it. That's the incredible witness of the Hebrew Bible, that God's people somehow trust God when they're not in power. I think that's maybe the most revolutionary thing about the story that we inherited. I don't see that in most other stories of the ancient world.
No, that's so good.
People knew their God was great because their God had given them the victory. And if their God didn't give them the victory, then they just assumed that, whoever beat them's God was great. And the wild thing about, the Babylonian exile, which is where the scholars tell us most of the Hebrew Bible was written down, is that here's people who are living under the rule of another people and another story about who God is, who say, we're here because we weren't faithful to our God. And our God's going to open up a way for us to go through the wilderness and go back to, our God is still in control. That's the craziest idea in the world.
That is so crazy.
And that's what faith means. And part of the reason that white folks in America have so little understanding of faith is that we haven't been able to trust our God if we weren't in control. Which is why we have to, in the American story, we have to look to the brush arbors and the margins of the plantation to reconstruct and relearn the gospel, because that's where people who were not in control heard the story of Jesus, heard the story about how that God had brought, Israel out of Egypt before they raised that Jesus from the dead. And if God can do that, then my Lord, maybe he'll even, if God delivered Daniel, maybe he'll even deliver me. Maybe when we hear, go down Moses way down in Egypt land, maybe when we hear swing low, sweet chariot coming for to carry me home, maybe we can even have the faith to run off into the woods and, grab Harriet Tubman by the hand. They called her Moses, and never look back, just believing that this story was going to get us to freedom. So that is the experience of faith that I'm trying to lean into. The people who are living down there in the borderlands, who watched this country take their land from Mexico right after Mexico voted to abolish slavery in the 1840s. They took that land because they wanted to be able to keep slaves on that land. And now 150 years later, they've militarized this border, and they've said, even though your family's been on both sides of this line for generations, you can't see them over there anymore. And I was down there last fall with, Sister Maria, who walked us out into the Rio Grande for a reunion in the middle of the river, just so she could see a couple of her sons that she hadn't seen in 16 years. And, I looked at them living there in that reality, as members of the Catholic Church, where she took us the next day to her parish and talked about her faith. And I realized, my God, this is what faith means. This is, to believe that God can be God and can hold you together and bring you through in the midst of that. That's where you learn what faith means. I just think white folks have so little faith because we haven't been able to trust the story when we're not in control.
Yeah. We think the story means we're supposed to be in control.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you read it that way, when you read it that way, you might have political power, but you completely miss the power of the story, right? There's no possibility of knowing what resurrection means, like what it means to actually live into resurrection power, if the only thing you can trust is worldly power. Yeah. And that's right there in the Apostle Paul. I was just preaching it on Sunday because that's his letter to the Corinthians, the second letter to the Corinthians, because he says, we're in this struggle. We face death every day, and it's at every hand, and we don't know if we're going to make it. But he says we hold on because we know that the power of resurrection that raised Jesus from the dead is available to us. So we can keep going even when it looks like we're being crushed. Never get to know what that means. Never get to know what that means until you're willing to step away from the neat and tidy world of white control and into those spaces where people who are struggling for their lives against the power of whiteness are able to show us what faith really means.
Jeez, man.
That's why I'm part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Because these folks embody the gospel to me, They flesh out for me what this Bible that I've been reading all my life really means. And again, like I said, the people who raised me made me memorize the thing. I've got all these scriptures in my head, so I don't even have to have the Bible open. I'm just out here watching people, and I hear the verses coming back to me. There's Paul saying, "I'm crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives within me. And this life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." It's one thing to memorize that. I'm so glad I did memorize it, but it tickles me and really stirs up my soul to see people who are fleshing that out in the struggle to love their family and to stand with their community and to struggle for justice in the world. It's a beautiful thing.
Man, before we let you go, this has been so enjoyable for Adam and I just to get a chance to talk with you about this incredible book. Where can people, first and foremost, where can they find this book, and where's the best place to go for them to keep up on your work and what you're up to?
Well, the book is called Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion, and I hope you'll find it at your local bookstore. We had a great discussion about the book at the local bookstore here in Durham last night. I think bookstores are important public spaces, and so support your local bookstore. You can learn more about me and the kind of stuff I write at an author website that I have that's just my name, JonathanWilson-Hartgrove.com.
So good, man. Hey, last thing, all this talk, what do you want people to go do? What can people start to look at and do other than read your book?
Well, when I was living in Philadelphia when 9/11 happened, and George W. Bush was president, and a lot of white evangelicals thought that, God had ordained him to be president, and so what he said was what we should do. And so it was increasingly clear that we were going to go to war. And I remember feeling uncomfortable with that, feeling like, this sort of knee-jerk reaction to attack somebody because we had been attacked just wasn't what Jesus meant when he said, if someone strikes you on the one cheek, turn the other one to them. And so I was I was young, and I was trying to learn from people who had been walking this way of Jesus and who practiced Christian nonviolence. And so I heard that a guy named Father Dan Berrigan was coming to town, and Father Dan had been part of the Christian peace movement since he and his brother took some draft cards out of a selective service office in Catonsville, Maryland, and during the Vietnam War, and poured napalm on them and burned them in the parking lot. They knelt down and prayed the Lord's Prayer in the parking lot, and some people were there and took pictures, and it was on the cover of Time magazine the next week. But they became these kind of leaders of direct action. And so I wanted to sit with Father Dan in that situation. I wanted to hear from him, like, what should we do? What should we do? Our country's going to go to war again. What should we do? And so I was real eager, and with some other young people who were eager to, get a word from him. And he showed up, and he had a pocket full of poems he had been writing, and he pulled out his poems. He was reading these poems for a few minutes, and I thought, like, when is he going to tell us what to do? And finally he paused for a while, and he said, when I was your age, somebody looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. They said, don't just do something, stand there. and and then he just kind of paused. And I think what he was, Father Dan was a poet, and poets pay attention. And I think what he was trying to say to us was learn to pay attention, learn to stare and to see what's really going on. Of course, we have to do something. There's all kinds of things that have to be done. But I think people who are blind are more likely to do the wrong thing, are more likely to do something that's going to screw stuff up than to just own that we need to be about deep repentance. And that's going to mean paying attention, and it's going to mean being in that place like Paul when he realizes he's blind, and taking somebody by the hand who's willing to show you the way. So I would say the most important thing to do is to find someone in your community who is living the faith out of a place of marginalization, a place of not having power, and learn what faith means from them, and ask them what they need you to do in order to achieve the things that they need for them and their family to survive.
Man, Jonathan, thank you. Thanks for your work. Thanks for paying attention.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for leading others.
Deconstruction is always ultimately about reconstruction. So I'm glad to talk about reconstruction with the deconstructionists.
Super cool, man. Super, super cool. Hopefully we cross paths and then we can give you a big hug someday.
Hey, if I'm coming through Ohio again, I'll let you know.
Please do,
next
man.
time.
Absolutely.
Please do.
We got lots of reconstructing to do in Ohio for sure.
Heck yeah, man.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, grace and peace to you, and ending up, on your tour here, and all your book talking and all that kind of stuff, and your ministries, and just many blessings on you, friend. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Bless y'all. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
You lit the fire out, and it's right in front of me. You stood tall, the fire began to let out.
Dear Lord.
I know. Where do you begin?
Oh my gosh. I mean, that's one of those ones that could have been a 2-parter or a 3-parter.
Yeah.
Easily. Just the fact that, so many people that listen to this podcast find themselves deconstructing, a version of the gospel that's focused on saving people from going to hell forever, and realizing that, like kind of a white nationalistic version of their religion has been, eerily handed to them in ways that has maybe paved ways of injustice and built structures of supremacy and really ugly things that are very anti-gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah, the gospel needs some reconstructing, and oh my gosh, we like to deconstruct and reconstruct, and it's just so much there. Everybody, you got to follow this guy. Not only read the book, read the footnotes and read some of the stuff that he points you to.
Yeah.
And dig deeper. I think that's one of the things that I would really like to say. I think that he does a really good job of giving a high level, overview of this stuff, and kind of leaves it up to you to say, keep having conversations, keep digging, keep asking, and keep uncovering. Man, we covered so much in that episode.
Yeah, I loved his bit about waking up to racial blindness, because it made me think back to the conversation we had with Drew Hart, where he talks about the subtle forms of racism and how we so arrogantly think, especially in the United States, that we've moved past it. We've moved beyond it, and that like the thing that drives me nuts is when people are, I don't see color. It's like, and then Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove talks about the fact that in his book he talks about taking that racial bias test, because your racial tendencies are very, very sneaky and subtle.
Yeah.
I took that years ago. I remember I thought, and I was sitting there from the same perspective where I'm like, oh, I'm good, man. I'm the least racist person you've ever met, and I sat down and took it, and I was like, oh no.
I'm so woke.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm so woke.
It's like, no, I'm not, and I need to, it's something that unfortunately is built into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that as a result of that we have to continually work towards every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to have to be an active, conscious effort to push back against that tendency.
Yeah.
So I think guys like him, guys like Drew Hart are just doing absolutely vital work, especially considering the current climate.
Yeah, I think that just in general, so much of what we do, and this is in a really important way, part of what I'm about to say, but so much of what we do is built around just giving people permission and even encouragement to just pay attention, to not sleepwalk through this thing, this journey. And paying attention is costly. because it's going to disrupt your comfort zone. And your comfort zone, I always kind of like to say the comfort zone is a prison that your ego likes to chill in. You know? And paying attention is going to start to notice like, oh, this isn't a comfortable bed. This is like a cot. And these aren't, nice walls. These are prison bars. Like, I got to get out. There's some things wrong here when you start to pay attention. I don't know if you've ever read that short little David Foster Wallace commencement speech. It's called This Is Water. Yeah, so like a lot of people have read that. And like it starts off with this anecdote about the old fish that swims past the two younger fish in the morning. And he goes, how's the water this morning, boys? And they go, what's water?
Right.
And it's just so funny because paying attention is incredibly costly. And to pay attention means to start to notice things that you've just been taking for granted all the time. And if you've been taking for granted, here's where it gets really painful. It also means you're complicit in it because we're all responsible.
Yeah.
We're all responsible. We are responsible. And so to start to wake up, to start to ask questions, start to have conversations, I've had the benefit of having a very, very dear friend allow me to come to him. His name's Ted. He's like my brother from another mother. We work together. And he, as an African-American, has had a completely different experience than I have. And I feel like an idiot, but I always come to him like, hey, dude, I got to ask you a question. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say this or like, what, you got to like explain this to me or like help me understand this. And they have been some of the best conversations I've ever had in my life. And it takes a degree of like, I got to be uncomfortable enough to be like, I don't know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
And like paying attention and learning more about like what is actually happening in ways that you can't see it.
And it probably meant a lot to him to have somebody actually take the time to say, all right, look, like I'm trying not to be offensive and I'm trying to learn and I'm trying to understand and seek to understand. We say that all the time.
Right.
So
yeah, and I think they have meant something to him. I think we're very good friends. At least I think we are.
Let's call him right now.
Let's call him right now. When we get Ted on the line, he would love it. Oh my gosh, he'd be great.
Oh, we should.
Yeah. I don't know if he listens to this, but love you, Ted. Yeah. What else, man? That's they listen to the episode. We don't have to rehash it all, but
yeah,
so good.
As usual, big thanks to everybody who's follows us on Twitter, joined the Patreon family, checks out our blog, on our website and just supports us in any way they can, whether it's just telling a friend about the podcast or leaving us a 5-star review on iTunes. That helps tremendously. Just thank you to everybody. The band this week, the artist rather this week, and I'm probably going to butcher this name, so I'm so sorry in advance, but Kina Granis, I want to say that's how we pronounce it, but she's an artist that is just tremendous. Like, love her music, and she has a really interesting story as well. She, not to give the whole thing away, but if you go to her website, she had a crazy incident where she went over to play music in a foreign country, and her concert got shut down, and she got stuck there for, I think, 4 months.
You were telling me about this.
It's insane, yeah. So she thought that, hey, I might end up spending the rest of my life in jail just perform. I think the situation was they arrested her and the band for performing music without a license or something crazy. And so she has this crazy story where it forced her to really take a look at things that were important to her. And so she has this great blog post on her website where she talks about how every day she would wake up and find one thing to be grateful for. And it's just this really moving story. And aside from just making brilliant music. So
it's awesome, dude.
So if you like that, check that out. Buy her music, support her, go see her live. And as always, follow our Spotify playlist where we will add one of her tracks, and you can follow all the previous
delicious treats.
Artists. Yeah.
Well, happy summer, everybody.
Indeed.
Be careful out there. Be respectful, be humble, keep having conversations, keep deconstructing. For now, we are your hosts. I'm Adam Narlock.
And I'm John Williamson.
Grace and peace, guys.
That song reminds me of summers, of family, of backyards, of you and me. If I went went back there, straight back to the place where I wondered what we could be. I'd laugh. Who'd have thought? Who'd have thought? That song reminds me of New Heart, of 90s, of petty and heavy things. I still remember what life was like back then, before I had learned to speak. I'd hide, sing it out, sing it out. Sing it out, sing it out. I felt it all, the kissing and fighting. I know the cost. I stayed home on New Year's Eve. All in all, I'd rather be right here than falling off the pages of history. Pages of history. If I remind you of childhood, of memories, of times both bitter and sweet, let's take that feeling right here to this moment and sew it into the scene.